Hello and welcome to Of Significance, the statistics podcast where we actually use a 1971 Acroprint time clock to get to our podcasting equipment. I'm your every person host, Brent Buckwright here, and with me are my co-hosts. One is always clocked in and the other is always punched out. It's Dr. Nathan Woods and Dr. Steve Bronars. Nathan, Steve, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks, Brent. Doing great, Brent.
So last fall, a federal appeals court held that the battery company East Penn Manufacturing is still liable for all actual pre- and post-shift activity time rather than a reasonable time it should take to finish tasks. Because some East Penn workers deal with hazardous materials, they may spend time before and after their shifts showering and putting on uniforms. It's a period of time which in labor and employment is called donning and doffing. So East Penn paid for pre and post shift time, but the amount was allegedly insufficient. It might be a little confusing why there's a question about whether a company has to pay for seemingly work-related time. But as with all parts of labor and economics, things get complicated fast. And this creates some interesting implications about how companies pay workers, how we think about all job compensation, and what the public thinks labor law should be in America. So to talk about all of this and more, we've brought an attorney with expertise in wage general litigation and compliance, as well as a whole host of work and research on discrimination and whistleblower claims, employment policy and compliance, and unfair competition disputes. John Lassetter is an attorney with Littler Mandelson PC. John, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks. I'm excited to be here.
So I want to start with the important stuff. John, when did you get your guitar and when did you decide that going pro wasn't worth it?
I started playing when I was 12. I still haven't decided that going pro isn't worth it.
That's the right answer.
To bring my 8-year-old daughter. My 8-year-old daughter and I are in a band now called what are we called? Branded, and we're gonna hit the top of the chart soon. So
what type of music do y'all play?
Well, she would tell you that we're pop punk, so I guess we're pop punk.
Perfect. I see. So you're really
I take my orders from her.
Yeah, you're kind of Ringo right now. You got to sit aside. You're supporting there. You know, whatever Paul and John want to do, you've got to follow.
That's exactly right. But hey, if it takes me to the top, I'm happy. So
stardom awaits. So first let's get into the material of this. I want to start with some of the basics. What is donning and doffing, and why does this matter at all?
So donning and doffing is essentially if you have a particular job where you are required to wear a particular set of clothing or equipment. The donning is the putting on, the doffing is taking it off, and most people have to meet some sort of dress code, but the donning and doffing cases that we're going to be talking about really talk about donning and doffing, putting on and taking off of clothing and equipment in the workplace, as opposed to when you would do that at home and come to work.
So when it comes to evaluating any kind of pre or post shift work, is all of that considered donning and doffing? Is there anything other than preparing yourself to work with hazardous materials that qualifies?
So donning and doffing, I would say, is one subset of cases that look at pre and post shift work. But there are pre and post shift work cases that focus on things like booting up computers, going through security screenings. But as it relates to getting ready for hazardous work, most of the time the pre and shift post cases focus on donning and doffing, and sometimes things like safety meetings and that type of thing that might happen before the workforce hits the work floor, so to speak.
So, John, I think that it was interesting how you described that, because you were making a distinction about something that you are required to do for work in terms of you need to wear this protective equipment. The employer requires that. And so in these cases, it seems like more and more the information that's being used is based on timestamps in terms of when someone enters a building or swipes in. And is the presumption that every minute that occurs after someone has clocked in is compensable time, or is it possible that some employers are having workers, even if they're not doing any donning and doffing, they get to work early, they clock in, then they go to the break room and read a newspaper? How can we tell whether it's compensable time or not, whether whatever you're doing after you've clocked in is something that the employer requires, or does that even matter for what what the employer is on the hook for?
Well, it does matter. And I think I'll start with just federal law, which is what the federal law, the Fair Labor Standards Act, is what the East Penn case focused on. And there, it's not going to be a model of clarity, but the standard under the federal FLSA to determine what is and what is not work in terms of pre and post shift work is the question you have to answer is, was it integral or indispensable to their principal activities? So if the answer to that question is yes, it was integral or indispensable to what they do for their primary job, then it's compensable. Now, applying that standard to a variety of activities is why we have such a robust body of case law on these issues. So the question of whether or not, if you clock in and go get coffee and don't really actually start doing anything that's related to your job for a half an hour, even though you're clocked in, the employer could take the position that, hey, that's not compensable time. You have not started your work day yet. But once you perform that first act of work, and maybe that is putting on a hazmat suit because you deal with hazardous chemicals, that starts the workday. And federal law requires that we capture all of that time and pay for it with very little exception. And that's kind of the heart of the East Penn case is were we capturing all the time we were supposed to or not?
So I think in your example, just to get this clear, if you put on the protective gear and then get a coffee, the workday has already started. So it's up to the managers to say, hey, let's move it along here while you're getting your coffee. Whereas if it was in the reverse order, the employer would have a better case to make that, well, the workday hasn't started yet because it can't start until you're in your protective gear. Is that kind of what you're saying there?
That's right. And what we're really talking about here is a concept called the continuous workday doctrine. So that looks at when's the first act of work, and then the workday continues unless it's broken up by the conclusion of work for the day, or at least what we would call a bona fide meal period. So in the scenario you just pointed out, you're exactly right. If I put on my hazmat suit and then take 10 minutes that's the first act of work for the day, and then I take 10 minutes to go get coffee and maybe go to the restroom or whatever, that 10 minutes, because it's not a bona fide meal period, counts as time worked. The day has started. And so employers do have an incentive to instruct people how to go about those tasks, like what sequence to do it in, for that reason.
Not that it's got any bearing on anything I'm saying today, but for what it's worth, I was one of the experts in the East Penn matter. And this is probably not a plausible example, but sticking with the same one, I put the hazmat suit on. Instead of taking a 10-minute break for coffee, I take a 45-minute break for coffee. At that point, is there an argument? I put the gear on. I didn't take it off, but is there an argument there that is enough of a break of time that you would stop the clock on the day? Or
yeah, absolutely. So when I say bona fide meal period, what that really means under federal law is at least a 20-minute period, preferably 30, but at least 20 minutes of uninterrupted time for me. So in your example, Nathan, that 45 minutes after I put on my hazmat suit, maybe that takes me 2 minutes. That 2 minutes is compensable. But if I immediately go to a 45-minute break for me to get coffee, that is a bona fide meal period that does not need to be counted as time worked. Maybe hard to capture all of that in time records accurately, but conceptually that is correct. Yeah.
So if I put on my work uniform pants, then went to go get coffee, then put on the shirt, then started drinking the coffee, then put on my one glove, and then wait another 10 minutes and put on the other glove, that wouldn't violate the rule?
I think you're on the clock the whole time.
I'm on the clock.
Well, it depends on it. The honest truth, this is where it gets into the nitty gritty of the case law is, were the items of clothing you were putting on integral or indispensable to your workday or not? Now, courts have pretty clearly held that very specialized gear like hazmat suits, or maybe it's a freezer suit because you're working in a freezer all day in a food warehouse, that's specialized enough that it is integral or indispensable to the job. But things like normal clothing, shirts, pants, that probably won't trigger the beginning of the workday. And I know that sounds a little crazy, like we're splitting hairs, but that's truly how the case law sort of breaks this all out. So the answer, Brent, is with everything you described, you may not actually have started your workday unless a particular thing you put on would be found to be integral or indispensable to that. Now, that's federal law, and state law is a little different. So we can get into that if you'd like. But right now, I just want to be clear, I'm just talking the federal concepts at the moment. So,
well, there's a question, as I understand it, in the East Penn matter, and this comes up in plenty of other workplaces where they did compensate people for pre and post shift time, but it was a fixed number of minutes at the beginning and end of your shift. This appeal seemed to affirm that every minute of time doing something that's seemingly work related has to be compensated. So under federal law, is there flexibility to how many minutes I'm going to be required to pay, or is there any ability for me as an employer to just say, do a set number of minutes at the beginning of an end and feel safe?
Well, I think what we learned from the East Penn case and other cases like it is the concept of estimating time for any particular activity, even if it's a very educated guess based on a robust time and motion study, for example, may leave you vulnerable as an employer to a claim, because an employee may come in and say, it took me longer than the, let's say, 10 minutes that you allotted for that, and you owe me the extra 5. And that's really kind of how the East Penn case played out, is they, at the time the case was brought, the employer was paying 10 minutes at the beginning and end of the day for things like taking on and off specialized equipment and showering. The parties in that case didn't argue over whether or not that time was compensable. The employer stipulated to that. And that's a little unusual, frankly, but not unheard of, but just that wasn't an issue in the case. What was an issue is exactly what you said, Brent. And what we learn is, the FLSA, according to this court, expects employers to pay for every minute of work. And if your estimates are incorrect and employees work more than that, you're going to be on the hook for that. There are some exceptions to that. And one of those is played out in the East Penn case. It's called the de minimis doctrine. And what that defense is essentially saying is, this time that we didn't pay for, we agree the employee paid it or worked it, but we can't capture it. It's too hard to do. It's too fleeting. But in this day and age, with electronic time clocks and an extraordinary number of resources at our fingertips to capture time really quite precisely, courts are becoming more and more reticent to apply that doctrine. Back in the day when we kept time by way of a punch clock or even writing it down, that it was a different story, and courts are a little bit more amenable to giving employers leeway. But that doctrine is not one that courts are very amenable to now, and that's certainly the case in East Penn. The court did not find that the de minimis doctrine applied. So are there escape hatches for employers or some flexibility? Yes, but I think as technology becomes more and more prevalent and we are able to capture time electronically, courts are a little bit more skeptical of those escape hatches.
One of the things that we think about with this is that, okay, that sounds fine, but then the implication is, let's say most of the people really can take the 5 minutes, and once in a while it takes somebody 6 or 7 minutes, and so there's going to be more of an effort required, I think, on the part of the employer to manage that and say, either, hey, you need to get that done faster, or you need to put in a time edit request or something like that. Is one possibility for employers that they have a very robust, ability on the part of the employee to say, okay, you're going to get the 5 minutes still, but on the exceptional case when you need 6 or 7 or 8 minutes, go edit your time, and we can demonstrate that approach, is real. It's not just kind of on paper. Can employers go down that road as kind of an intermediate option, or is that not a good idea?
No, I think it's a good idea. I would definitely describe it as an intermediate option. But if you're going to take the approach of, hey, we're going to estimate time, let's say it's 5 minutes, using your example, you definitely want to have that ability, give the employees the ability to say, hey, it took me longer today for whatever reason to don and doff this equipment or whatever it is. And I'm reporting that, and you're going to pay it. And this is the process by which you will do it. So to your point, though, Nathan, you want it to be more than just on paper. You would want to demonstrate that people actually do that. That bears out in timekeeping data. And typically you'd be able to see when time was edited, even in a timekeeping system. So yeah, right. It's an intermediate option. It's certainly one I would recommend if an employer is going to go down this route, that you have that type of reporting ability. But again, it's still somewhat fallible because employees will often claim, yeah, it was on paper, but I was told not to use it. Right. So there's some risk there, but it's not a bad option.
We sometimes have some interesting studies where, in an allegation like that, and the employee comes back and says, well, it wasn't a real option. And we will be looking at the data and saying, well, but somebody in your department or in your job, in your location, did take that option that same day, or it was relatively prevalent, even if you didn't use it. Plenty of other people did, kind of as evidence that option really was available.
But if we're going to stick with the federal example, Nathan, I want to push back against your idea, because just because one day you took you 2 minutes longer, I would want you to bank the time in the other days when you got done 2 minutes early, because at the end of if I give you 5 minutes a day, let's say at the beginning and the end, that's like 50 minutes over the course of the week. I think I get back to what John, what you're saying is like, we need to just like record this time, because I would want to know like how long it was taking you every day, because why would I only make the adjustments when it took you longer? You should come and edit your time entry when it takes you less time, right? That way I'm not paying as much in overtime.
Those are fair points, Steve.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of pushing towards, if you can measure the time and not estimate the time, then of course you have to monitor people and you have to nudge them to like, hey, let's get into work because you're on the clock. But I just see this as being like the estimated time thing. I don't know. I see problems with it.
This is, John, where we would usually say we're not attorneys, so we have no idea. But this time we get to ask you, so it's great.
No, that's I think everything you just said, Steve, the risks of that estimating practice really bear out in this East Penn case. I mean, it was a $22 million price tag because people didn't use the escape hatch and report extra time. At least the jury found that, right? So I think you're right. I mean, the Cadillac solution, as I would call it, is precisely record time with the time clock. So if, for example, you have a locker room where people have to go don and doff equipment, just put a time clock right there. So you can get them when they come in and catch them when they come out, and you have a more accurate depiction of the workday. But to your point, Steve, you would have to it's a different way of thinking about time management for the management team at an employer. They'd have to really be monitoring what people are doing and make sure people aren't dilly-dallying and moving through their workday in a way that they might not be used to in some workplaces. So that's a change that if you're an employer, you might have to think through.
Yeah, and I think in these cases, it's a lot different for the back pay, because you weren't going through all that. And then you go, I get this back pay for what had already occurred. And you may not be thinking about, okay, now that we've gotten to this point, now I'm going to be monitored more closely and managed more closely. And I don't have the time to dilly-dally, I think was the legal term that you use. But it's like, there's you don't get something
Yeah,
for
it's a term
nothing.
of art.
So, but I think that for the work that's already been done and the time that wasn't paid, looking backwards, it's a very different mindset than like, okay, from now on, it's going to be different.
It seems like it creates a scenario where we're going to end up with this trade-off between how much a manager is going to have to micromanage all their employees if they're going to keep track of every single minute of time. How much of that is a thing that the law isn't super interested in trying to deal with, because that's not the question before it. They're trying to decide you've got to pay people based off of this work relevant time, not what is the most enjoyable experience for a worker on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, look, I think the court is looking at you got to pay for all working time based on the continuous workday doctrine and the integral and indispensable standard. And it's less worried with about how folks are being managed to that, as long as the management processes aren't unlawful. And what I've found in workplaces where changes are made along the lines of what we're discussing and timekeeping becomes a much more precise thing. And in workplace, sometimes employees don't like that because it does, in their minds, put a pinch on how they go about their workday. They might like to come in and put on a uniform and then go get coffee, and the employer is saying you can't do it that way anymore. So there are some behavioral changes that you really do have to think through. It's not as easy as just flipping a switch in any particular work environment. But I'm just going to go back to, I do think the Cadillac solution here for any employer to avoid the types of results we see in some of these cases is do your absolute best to accurately record time and try to steer away from the types of practices where you're estimating or allowing people to punch in before they actually start work. Those are riskier practices.
I think that this concept that you're talking about, Brent, I remember seeing it referenced by the DOL itself in their proposed rule for changing the salary threshold. Because the question is, if you used to be salaried and exempt from the FLSA, but now the salary threshold changes, are we going to change the way that we pay you to compensate you for overtime? Are we going to switch you to an hourly employee? And I think even the DOL acknowledged that, but people may not like the idea if they used to be salaried. Now, obviously, it's for your whole week, not just the time that you're in the locker room here, but going to a system where now you're being paid by the hour, you're recording all your time, that may be something that they find less than appealing if they used to do the same job, but now they have to abide by different rules because that's what the federal law says. So I do think that that's a point that it does affect the utility of the workers there in terms of how they're viewing their workday.
So putting on protective gear is one kind of type of donning and doffing, but now that we have more remote work, there might be things that are instrumental to doing the job, but aren't necessarily preparing to handle hazardous materials. I don't know, turning on your computer might be one, or setting up some system you've got at home. Is there a legal approach to account for how complicated the differences are between remote and in-person shift beginning and endings?
The short answer to your question, Brent, is the law, as it looks at these issues, is the exact same law. So there's been no change in the law to accommodate remote work in this sense. The courts and the law, the federal law, I'll just speak to federal at the moment, do still expect that we capture all working time, and even if someone's working remote. And the question then becomes, well, what is work? Now we're not donning and doffing, but to your point, Brent, is the act of turning on my computer, signing into programs, is that work? And at least two circuit courts, I believe it's the 9th and the 10th, have found that if your job involves working on a computer, if you're, for example, a call center employee who's taking in calls and putting notes into a system or selling things online, so to speak, the act of turning on a computer and signing into programs is something that those two circuits have found is integral and indispensable to the workday. It starts the workday then and needs to be captured as work time. But that is, of course, not the easiest thing in the world to do in a remote work environment. But we are seeing a lot of lawsuits on that type of issue at the moment.
One thing it makes me think about is those programs that exist that allow you to monitor what your computer usage is, what websites you're visiting, how many keystrokes you've hit, whether or not your mouse has been toggled. And I wonder if there are now more incentives for an employer who's got employees doing remote work to keep more track of that kind of thing. Because I could see someone doing something close to my joke scenario of, hey, I'm putting on one boot. Hey, I'm turning on my computer. Why don't I go, get a cup of coffee, start up a load of laundry, and then come back to do the actual work time? An employer is not interested in trying to pay for that, and now technologically has more ways of keeping track of it.
I thought in the way in which you described, I think the donning and doffing so well was like, hey, this is integral to this and really not something else. Like turning on the computer, you could do that to check your personal email, right? So unless it's a computer that you only use for work and not for searching the internet or watching YouTube or checking your email, it's a little bit different. It's like, closer to your earlier description of, well, you get dressed in the morning to go to work. Well, you'd be, putting on nearly the same thing if you were going out for a meal or, just shopping or something like that. So if it seems less obvious to me, like that started the workday because you might've been turning on the computer for something else, as opposed to like opening up a particular program on the computer. Maybe I'm just like splitting hairs like we were talking about before, but it does seem like that's kind of a different issue if it's a computer you could use for many different things as opposed to work alone.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And you're kind of getting to a point I was kind of thinking about as well, which is, and Brent's question focused on this too. What if someone's using the computer for personal use or doing, to your point, Steve, maybe they're turning it on to check their email and not work. And in those circumstances, the law would say, look, if you're doing it for personal reasons, it's not work. The trick, though, the challenge for employers is when I'm looking at a data set and the employee is saying it was all work, how do I disprove that? And you could, Brent, to your point, get into data that looks at the sequence of that they did things. Maybe it's they turned on the computer and they really did just dilly-dally on Facebook, to go back to that term, for an hour before they started work. Or, and this wouldn't necessarily bear out as much in the data, they turn on their computer, made coffee, got their kids to school, and then an hour later they're turning on programs. You'll see an absence of data there. In all of those scenarios, in the scenario where I turn on my computer and then I go off and do personal things, turning on the computer might still be compensable that few seconds. But if I then take at least a 20-minute break for personal reasons, that wouldn't be compensable. But it's really tricky to capture all this. So a couple of ideas for employers would be, Brent, I think yours is a good idea to have a way to monitor what people are doing. But the other thing I've seen employers do is say, look, we're going to give you this computer, but it is just for work. And they take measures, and I'm not technologically savvy to tell you how to accomplish this, but there are measures I've seen taken where people are not allowed to use it for personal reasons. Technologically, they're just blocked off from using personal email and that kind of thing. I tend to think that that's a better way to go about it, because then you're controlling the device, right? But it doesn't eliminate all the issues. So
I wonder, given the nature of remote work now, is it possible that some previously non-compensable behavior becomes compensable in a work from home scenario? So, for example, if I'm a remote worker who, 5 days out of the week, I work from home, I do my boot up the computer and, log into whatever programs, but I'm required to come into the office one day out of a month for a particular meeting, does that commute suddenly become part of the compensable time or not?
Great question. And the one thing that will matter for this, I'll just say, is it will matter whether or not you've already started working at home before you commute. So if I do an hour of work at home and then immediately hop in my car and drive to another place, maybe it's my office for a meeting, my workday started when I started work at home and I immediately commuted or traveled. That would be considered during the day travel time. It wouldn't be considered a normal commute. However, if under your scenario, I go directly from home, I get up in the morning, have my coffee and breakfast, and then drive to the office for a meeting, you would have, I believe, as the employer, a pretty good argument that that would be considered a regular commute, especially if the person is told beforehand, hey, you can work from home 5 days a week, but every once in a while, once a month or once a week, you're going to be expected to come into this office. That would be a pretty reasonable grounds for the employer to say, well, yeah, they don't commute every day, but we did tell them that we were going to have them come in once a week. And when that occurs, the drive time is a commute that is non-compensable. Now, like I said, those are sort of two very straightforward scenarios, but it really does matter whether or not they've performed any work before they commute, or conversely, if they continue to work after they get home. Maybe it's an hour-long meeting. I come home and immediately continue to work. In that case, the travel time back from the office to my remote workplace would also be compensable. So I'm trying not to make it overly complicated, but unfortunately, it's not as straightforward a question as maybe we'd like, which is maybe why I have a job. I don't know, but
I feel like we're giving lots of great advice to workers on how to game the system. Hey, put on half your uniform, go get a cup of coffee. Oh, you've got to drive into the office in the morning? Why don't you plug in and do like 10 minutes of work in advance? Hey, make sure that if your company still has a rounding system for some reason, that you round in your favor. We're giving you all those great tips here.
Yeah, that's what we're here for. No, I think the takeaway for an employer is be very explicit in your expectations. For remote employees, this is the sequence we want you to do things in the morning. We don't want you walking away and doing personal things. You must turn on your computer and off you go. And this is how we're going to capture the time. And then if people don't follow it, you do have the right to discipline them as an employer. And that might just be initially verbal warnings that escalate on and on if people don't do what they're asked to do. But I think it's really important for employers in the remote environment to have really explicit policies about how these things are supposed to occur.
So, John, in a lot of these cases, whether it's, gotten to the point of litigation and expert reports and that kind of thing, or if it's something that's heading to a mediation of some kind, we are asked to analyze the data to show what the distribution looks like in some of those timestamps that we were talking about earlier. And, we spent a lot of time kind of expressing what that shows. And usually there's a lot of variability between employees or across time and maybe between different kinds of jobs or locations and that sort of thing in what the data might, at least we already talked about. We don't know what people are doing between these timestamps, but the timestamps themselves might be sometimes very close to the beginning of paid time or after the beginning of paid time, and sometimes well before, even hours before. And I know we spend some time showing you that kind of information. Is that useful at all? How does that play out, with the mediator, with the other side and the judge in these kinds of cases?
Yeah. Look, if we as the employer can demonstrate through data that there's a wide range of activity in a case like what we're talking about, I'll call it a pre and post shift case, so to speak, or an off the clock case. If we can show that the named plaintiff and his or her or their claims are vastly different than the folks they're trying to represent, that's a good thing for us, because it is the plaintiff's burden in a case like that to show they're similarly situated to the folks they're trying to represent. with respect to the claim they want to bring. And if their claim is, I did all of these things off the clock, and we can demonstrate, well, these folks didn't, that's a really good way for us to defend a class or collective certification claim. So we definitely use that. And in for pre-litigation, or maybe we're in mediation, we certainly use that type of data to demonstrate to our opposing counsel and to a mediator, hey, this case may not have the value you think it does because it's going to be really hard for you to achieve class certification. So take that into account when we're talking. I do think that's very effective. And it's precisely why we do go to the pains that you all go through to look for those types of patterns.
I think one way, John, that we look at these patterns too is, like we said, we don't really know what people are doing. But I think in the example we are motivating this, it's a pretty repetitive thing in terms of putting on protective gear. And if in some days the same person does it in 5 minutes, and other days it takes 15 minutes, it kind of begs the question, what was going on those days? And it provides some kind of example to us. And that's wondering too, does that help you as an attorney as well, saying, I think something else was going on during some of these outlier observations, because if most of the time that was pre-shift, it was 5 minutes between timestamp one and then time when you get to the assembly line or whatever. But every so often it's 15 minutes. I mean, maybe it is a meeting. Maybe who knows what it is, but it's, to us, it's saying there's something else going on. Is that how you would view it as well, in addition to this class certification issue you're talking about?
Yeah, definitely. On an individual basis in particular, those are the types of things I would look at in data and say, hey, if I'm in a position where I'm going to depose this person, we'd be asking about those types of issues to flesh that out. Because when you see inconsistency like that, to your point, Steve, something's going on, and we want to know what. And that can help in a case, again, because if it demonstrates that the named plaintiff acted differently than other people in the class, that may be enough to say, hey, well, you're just not in a position to represent these folks. You don't have the same claim. So we would definitely want to flesh that out. And even if I don't get a chance to depose them, we would be pointing to anomalies in the data like that to, again, put pressure on that concept, but also just to go after their and try to defend their individual claims as well. So yeah, we absolutely would look at it from that angle as well, for sure.
Many times what we see, and again, it might be all in kind of a heading to settlement sort of context, or maybe it's in litigation, exchanging expert reports, but you'll see an average of some set of data has been summarized as an average. And we spend a lot of time talking about, in general on this podcast, we spend a lot of time talking about how an average can mask a lot of information, and you might want to look underneath that average and make sure that that's a good summary measure if you're ever going to use one. But, that average is going to get dragged out by some of those outliers. Maybe the median is less susceptible to that, but the median can also, overstate what's really going on for large chunks of the data. And I think especially in these pre-shift, when we, as Steve was pointing out, when we think that whatever is going on is sort of the same, whether it's, I got to log on to my computer and log on to these two systems, but I do that every day. And same thing if I'm putting on my protective boots, I do that every day. If I am seeing a big clustering really close to, a minute or two, you would point that out presumably to a mediator and say, well, maybe that's the minimum amount of time that you actually needed. And to Steve's point earlier, that's the no dilly-dallying share of whatever is caught in that measure, because we see, I don't know, some really large clustering of the data around that number. Does that make sense?
It does. And, I probably talked to you, Nathan, more than anyone in the world about these exact concepts, but and I've learned a lot, frankly, from working with you all on these, but I absolutely agree. The average is very rarely the whole story. Now, sometimes the average looks pretty good to us, but I still want to know things like, let's look at the median and where things are clustering, because the other thing we may do let's say we're in a mediation setting again, because that's often where these things are discussed, is we may go in and say, hey, it looks to us like this task by and large could be accomplished in 2 minutes. And so plaintiff's claim that it was taken 15 just doesn't make sense. But we're willing to talk to you about 2 minutes. And you can try to use that in your negotiations in that way. But it certainly would matter in the context of litigation too. If again, it may go to the plaintiff's credibility if he, she, or they are claiming it takes me 20 minutes to do this thing. Maybe it's booting up a computer, but we can demonstrate, well, it looks like everyone else it took 2. What gives there? So that can be really useful in a variety of ways. So I very rarely just take average and run with it. And again, I've learned that from working with folks like you with the data science background, but it's been really, that's kind of how I have started to look at it in litigation context.
Yeah, the average, it seems so innocuous in some ways, but it isn't, because we know that the time, it can never be below 0 minutes, right? And then, it could be skewed in the other direction. So if there is this clustering around 2, but it doesn't take that many 10-minute, it's a handful of times to really bump up that average. And there's nothing on the other side of the distribution to say, well, it all will average out. For every 10 minutes, there's a minus 6 minutes or something. It's like, no, that's impossible. It would never be that. So that's why I think in these particular cases, even though there's just this tendency to say an average, it's such a good thing to calculate, it doesn't always work.
I don't know, Steve. I'm so fast at putting on a uniform, it takes me negative minutes. It's like lightning.
Yeah.
What we're learning is Brent's a time traveler, and that's pretty neat. Where's your flux capacitor?
Off the clock calculations are so difficult in a time travel scenario.
That's what that means.
I will say I've watched the Bill and Ted's, the first one, Excellent Adventure, with my 10-year-old son like 20 times now. So I am an expert on
time
phone booth time travel.
Yeah.
And Brent,
those were the good old days.
I believe you. Yeah, right. Rufus. Yeah.
So this East Penn decision, does it mean at this stage that everyone has to follow this ruling right now? What are the next steps? And, what is the interplay going to be between state and federal law?
Great question, because this is actually a Pennsylvania case, as I recall. So Pennsylvania is actually a state where the state law does differ from federal on this very topic. So I'll speak to that in just a moment. But to address your first question, this case would apply in particular to, of course, courts in the Third Circuit. So the district courts in the Third Circuit, I think the third's New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and maybe Delaware. But anyway, courts that are in the Third Circuit will have to follow East Penn as law unless or until the U.S. Supreme Court says otherwise. But outside of the third, we would certainly you could cite to this case as perhaps persuasive authority, but it doesn't necessarily control in the 9th, 10th, all the other circuits. And it doesn't control Pennsylvania courts or any other court, frankly, interpreting Pennsylvania wage and hour law. And the reason I bring that up is relatively recently, there was a ruling that found that Pennsylvania, we already knew this, Pennsylvania does not follow the Portal to Portal Act, the federal law that we've been talking about this entire time. And it actually has a much stricter view of what is compensable time. And in a recent ruling, a Pennsylvania court found that even just the act of walking to the time clock once you've arrived on an employer's premises is compensable time, no matter how long it takes. And the court found that Pennsylvania law does not recognize that de minimis concept we talked about. So you don't really have the argument necessarily that it only took me 10 seconds. Do I really have, what the courts there seem to be saying is under Pennsylvania law, you've got to capture and pay for that time. And that's a really great example of how state law can really complicate this issue. And you do need, at least at present, if the present state of the law, to follow whatever is the most employee favorable law. So if state law requires you to pay for more time, you're going to need to follow state law. And that Pennsylvania has become a very interesting jurisdiction for these issues precisely because of how the state law is being interpreted. And there are a number of states where that is somewhat of an open question. And by that, I mean, does this state align with federal law, or is it going to have a different approach to determining things like, for example, what is compensable time? And there are some states like Pennsylvania that have come out and said, we don't follow federal law. So it's not an open and shut issue pretty much anywhere in the country at the moment because of that. So
I'm guessing you should put your time clocks as close to the entrance of your facility as possible.
Parking lot.
But that was my question exactly, Nathan. Is like,
no, I think you should have a time clock implant.
That's right.
We should make, if we've got time travel, we're going to go for every sci-fi
Neuralink
concept
will
here.
now be putting time clocks into your brain, not just
we're getting like Demolition Man territory here.
Yeah.
You know?
Everything's going to be a Taco Bell.
No, I do think the practical implications of that, I don't think you're wrong, Steve. I think that the implications of that are move your time clocks as close to the entrance of your facility as you can. Maybe you're even going to need to add more time clocks to reduce wait time, because that wait time, if there's a queue to get to the time clock, that might be very likely under Pennsylvania law would be compensable. And you may even have to go so far as to then say, okay, let's do a time and motion study to see how long it's taking for folks to get to the time clock. But the decision I mentioned does mean for Pennsylvania employers, you probably want to be taking a look at those issues because Pennsylvania has a very strict view of what is compensable time, much more so than the federal law.
Let me throw this at you then, because obviously the time clocks and adding more time clocks, it just practically seems very hard. But nowadays we've got apps on our phone for everything. And so can I just tell everybody, look, you need to be clocking in on your phone, and it's up to you to clock in as you begin your walk from your car, hit the entrance of the building or whatever it might be. That way there's no potential allegation of waiting in lines, and it's really up to you. You should know when you started work. And then obviously if your phone battery's dead, there's some mechanism through which you can put the edit in later. But is that a solution the employees are thinking about?
More and more I am seeing employers adopt that type of solution. In particular, I mean, if you think about it, we were just talking about remote workers. That's a really great way for a remote work person to clock in even before they touch their computer. And then we don't have to worry about capturing boot up login time, or conversely shutdown time, because you could have them clock out after. So I have definitely seen employers adopt that in the remote work environment. And similarly, thinking about this Pennsylvania decision, you certainly could, Nathan, to your point, have them clock in before they even enter the facility. So that I tend to think that those are good solutions. Now, I am not going to pretend to be familiar with all the different offerings out there. I know there are probably a variety of apps that do these things, and I certainly can't endorse one or the other. But I do think that just conceptually that concept is a good one. I will just put in a quick caveat, though, that if you are having employees use their phones, their personal phones, for work-related reasons, there may be, in particular in a few states, expense reimbursement requirements you'll have to consider for having them use their phone for a work-related purpose. Now, I'm not going to rattle that all off, and we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but it is something to think about if you're going to require employees to use their personal device that they pay for a work-related reason. So for what it's worth. But I do think those are solutions that employers really should be thinking about. I tend to think they're a good workaround for some of these issues.
Well, John, thank you for being on to talk about all this with us. We'll have to have you on for another episode where we discuss Black Mirror scenarios and whether they're compliant with federal and state labor laws. Thank you for being here, John Lassetter.
Absolutely. This was really fun. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.